Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar, Academic Freedom Beyond the Classroom. If you need captions, you can press the CC button in your menu bar for closed captionings that are through Zoom AI. Welcome. I am Jason Gilbo. I use he and him pronouns. I am Executive Director of ASHE and joining you today from the lands of the Chitimacha. Really excited about this panel today to talk about these important topics that are affecting us a lot these days. I am available throughout the session. If you have any tech issues, just send me a private message. I also want to remind you all that when you registered for the event, you agreed to our event's code of conduct. Ideally, we won't have any issues that arise. But in case we do, I put that in the chat as a reminder. This webinar today is part of a series of webinars that have been kind of co-coordinated with our Presidential Commission for this year. They've had, I think, 3 or 4 other webinars. There's another webinar next week. And as part of this, we've also been able to partner with the AAUP Center for the Defense of Academic Freedom, and also excited today to partner with ACPA and have their president-elect Kelvin here with us today. So with that, we're still waiting on our moderator, Demetri, but I will go ahead and pin our panelists for today. And if you don't mind, just kind of getting us started with a quick introduction of yourself. Tell us who you are, a little bit about the work that you do, and a little bit about this topic and how it resonates for you. So, Isaac, why don't we start with you?
Great. Thanks so much, Jason, for organizing this, and ASHE for hosting, and thanks to everybody for coming and hearing about academic freedom and the kind of relationship of academic freedom outside the classroom. My name is Isaac Kamola. I teach political science at Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut. But I'm currently the director of the Center for the Defense of Academic Freedom at the American Association of University Professors. The center it was created with the idea that the attacks on academic freedom are changing and evolving and metastasizing, that the AAUP has historically thought about academic freedom in terms of the relationship between faculty members primarily and their institutions, and whether governing boards or presidents, administrators sanction and punish faculty for their speech. But as we know, the attacks on academic freedom are coming from all kinds of directions. They're coming from governors and state legislators, from the White House, from the Department of Education itself, not to mention, online trolls, foreign governments, and a whole bunch of other threats to academic freedom, the court system, in some cases. And so the Center for the Defense of Academic Freedom was set up to kind of think about this kind of evolving attack on higher education, and also create resources and tools for faculty members and for the broader academic communities in pushing back against these attacks on academic freedom, while also trying to communicate the value of academic freedom to a wide audience. So I'll leave it there and can kind of go into the AAUP's understanding of academic freedom and research, and but after the other panelists introduce themselves.
Thanks so much, Isaac. Kelvin.
Okay. So good afternoon or good morning to some, based on where you are in location. So my name is Kelvin Rutledge. I use he, him, his pronouns. And in my day work, I serve as the Associate Vice President within the Division of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Southern Connecticut State University, which is on the traditional homelands of the Quinnipiac and Paugussett peoples. And also have the fortunate privilege of serving as the 2025-2026 President-elect of ACPA, College Student Educators International, which is an organization of over 5,000 students, higher education and student affairs, professionals, faculty, and experiences in practitioners across the world. In my day-to-day experiences, I oversee some of our cultural centers here at the institution, work to help cultivate inclusive and positive employee environments, and do some collaborative compliance work at the institution. And through all of those buckets, work with faculty, staff, and students as we think about this idea of academic freedom. So happy to be here and happy to contribute.
Thanks so much, Kelvin. Jorge.
Hi, friends. My name is Jorge Almonte. I am the Assistant Director for Student Conduct at New York University in Manhattan. I use he, him, his pronouns. Today, I will be serving in the capacity of that student affairs professional that's not in the academic side of the house, and giving more of a perspective of how academic freedom pertains to those non-academic side of the house people, and particularly given some examples within the student conduct world that I've faced within the last year of being in this position, that may shed some light on academic freedom and how things are moving in our current political environment.
Awesome. Thank you all so much. So I live in a world with ASHE where the majority of our members are academics, folks who think about academic freedom kind of as Isaac shared from a very faculty-centric perspective. And when we think about academic freedom, we often think about tenure and promotion and the historical notions of higher education, the protections that at least historically have been granted to and safeguarded faculty who are doing important research that helps to inform society and the public. And a lot of times, I think folks who don't have those tenure protections in the faculty realm, folks who are early career, pre-tenure, and then folks in student affairs, other folks who are working on campus who just don't have that protection, but are still doing the important work to educate and support our students. So as we think about this, Isaac, we'll turn to you first. So faculty who are doing public-facing research and get targeted for their scholarship, we know there's a lot of historically, again, protections that exist. A lot of those are being threatened today. Uh, what are those protections? And then we've seen a lot of those break down. How and why are they breaking down in this current context?
Yeah, great question, Jason, and thanks for that. I think that the AAUP's understanding of academic freedom, the AAUP really comes out of this experience of faculty in the early 20th century being targeted for their political beliefs because they were socialists, pacifists, because they were Germans during the First World War and teaching in the US, because of they taught in ways that the church objected to. And there was a round of firings of faculty. And so the AAUP really kind of came up with this idea of academic freedom, thinking about faculty first, and basing that kind of claim to academic freedom on expertise, saying you have a particular kind of training, that you have gone through this very rigorous process, and therefore it makes sense for faculty to have primary regulation over the production of knowledge itself, right? So if I'm in a political science department, it should be political scientists who've trained and teach in the classroom, who should be the ones who determine what the curriculum looks like, what's a good book to teach, what's a good assignment to assign, and not the governor of Florida, right? We have the expertise to do that. And so the kind of the conceptual framework of academic freedom as it comes out of the AAUP is very much framed around this area of expertise, which I think is one of its strengths, but also one of its limitations. And I hope that this conversation here can probe at exactly those limitations. And then within that, the 1940 statement, which kind of lays out the principles of academic freedom, kind of lays academic freedom out in three ways: and academic freedom in teaching, in research, and in extramural speech. And so for this and thinking about outside of the classroom, I think that it's really important and that academic freedom in research is kind of widely recognized as the most kind of widely accepted kind of notion of academic freedom. So it says, the 1940 statement says, that teachers are entitled to full freedom of research and in publication of the results, subject to adequate performance of their other academic duties, which includes this kind of understanding of academic freedom as an individual right, but subject to collective regulation, right? So kind of academic freedom is oftentimes understood as a tenured faculty member saying, I have the right to say whatever I want without repercussion, right? But the AAUP's understanding of academic freedom instead sees that the production of knowledge takes place within a community, within a context of scholars, a community of scholars that are constantly regulating that community through peer review, through hiring decisions, promotion decisions, through the assessment of publications, through criticizing each other at conferences, challenging on ideas, pushing back on ideas. And so this idea of kind of a community of scholars self-regulating itself kind of makes sense, or is kind of really easy to defend when the public isn't looking at that community, and the community can kind of function kind of in its own domain. But increasingly, faculty are being asked to be public intellectuals and public scholars as well, and to put our research out into the public. And oftentimes institutions don't provide support for that. So I've worked with a number of faculty members who are public-facing intellectuals, and because of that work, they get picked up, they get written about by right-wing outlets that specialize in targeting faculty, that leads to targeted harassment, and they don't necessarily oftentimes receive the support from their institution. So I think that it's really important that that public-facing research does fall under that protection of academic freedom under the AAUP, but it can oftentimes also be the site in which there's a lot of controversy that is directed at the faculty. And the other area where kind of public-facing research is important is in the area of extramural speech. And extramural speech is the kind of the third part of academic freedom besides teaching and research that really focuses on the ability of faculty to speak as citizens, right? The idea is that, you know, on the one hand, faculty have certain kinds of expertise, and it's important to bring that expertise into the public. A good example of this was in Florida. There was a bunch of faculty who specialize in voter repression. They were asked to testify before the state legislature on a DeSantis bill around restricting the rights to vote. They were testifying based on their expertise. That would be an example of extramural speech, right? Publicly speaking in the areas of expertise. And then there's also, you know, extramural speech in areas where faculty do not have expertise. So I don't have expertise in the Middle East, but I may have really strong opinions about the Israel-Palestine conflict, and I could go on social media and kind of make those claims, right? To make certain kinds of arguments. As with research, the 1940 statement in the AAUP understands extramural speech as also kind of not absolute, right? So the direct wording from the 1940 statement is that college and university teachers are citizens. When they speak or write as citizens, they should be free from institutional censorship or discipline, but their special position in a community imposes special obligations. So again, that idea is not completely free to kind of say whatever you want, but there is certain restrictions on those. And those restrictions are, they should remember that that the public may judge their profession, and that they should at all times be accurate and exercise appropriate restraint, and make sure that they're not speaking for the institution, right? So that there's a recognition of a public right to speak, but it shouldn't be unnecessarily inflammatory. It shouldn't be in a way that claims to speak for the institution. And there's these certain kinds of limits. The way this plays out, ideally, although, you know, increasingly less so, is that if there's a feeling that a faculty has overstepped academic freedom, either in research or in extramural speech, that they should be held to a standard of cause, right? Did their actions demonstrate a cause that they are unfit for their position? And that should be evaluated internally through established policies and procedures. Increasingly, what we're seeing, especially kind of in the wake of the October 7th attack, as well as the assassination of Charlie Kirk and other recent events, is faculty are saying things in public. Those are being interpreted correctly or incorrectly and being used to fire faculty, to dismiss them, to put them on suspension for security reasons, which is itself a kind of disciplining. And instead, the process should be, if there is a sense that a faculty has overstepped the line or violated their side of that agreement of academic freedom, that there should be a deliberation that is subject to due process that determines whether their actions have demonstrated cause that they're unfit for their position. So that's how we should work ideally. I'll stop there to hear from my colleagues on the panel.
Thank you so much, Isaac. And with that, I'll actually turn it over to Demetri.
Yeah, hey everyone. I apologize for my tardiness. The Zoom link got lost and I was running from another event, but I'm really excited to be here and in community with everyone that is here and also with my esteemed co-panelists. Isaac, for full disclosure, I get to work with Isaac as a fellow through the Center for the Defense of Academic Freedom, and your articulation of academic freedom, both the privilege and the responsibility is so well said from the faculty perspective. But what I'm also really excited about with this conversation is to hear, different lenses, how that shows up for other people. So I want to invite Kelvin into the conversation. When you're leading, sort of diversity, equity, and inclusion work, sort of in this moment under intense scrutiny, whether directly or indirectly, I'm curious how you think about academic freedom. Do you have the same protections, the same responsibilities that Isaac just laid out? And what happens, when your work gets attacked? Like, does academic freedom play a shield? Break it down for us. Oh, you're on mute.
Of course, that would happen, right? I think at a core level, much diversity, equity, and inclusion work, one of the core tenets of this work is thinking about the ways that we're interrogating and responding to institutional culture and climate, and really beginning to think about what are tangible and realistic interventions to help amplify what is going right, but to address what also may not be going right, and where do we fall in between. I also think it's really important as I talk about this work that every institution has a context. And more importantly, I'm operating within a United States context. And that while global inclusion definitely impacts all of our employees and our students, I think one of the things that's really important about this time is centering a United States context. And I'm also in the northeastern part of the United States. And so within that, when we ask this question is, what does this work look like for me? I'm in a unionized environment. And so half of my team is unionized, but I am not. And so when we talk about protections, particularly what does labor relation contracts mean in terms of kind of overarching protection, and what does stewardship in terms of capacity look like as well. And so when I think about this concept of kind of academic freedom, I think it intersects because this work touches faculty, staff, students, and our external community partners, right? And so our faculty are cultivating feelings of inclusion and belonging on our campus. Academic freedom can either be a plus to that or a minus and create negative impacts, right? And so looking at those critical intersections kind of impacts the day-to-day work. And I think working in today's environment, as much as you can center evidence-based practices or research-informed work, we are often working at the intersections of both general public perceptions and institutional governing bodies, while also challenging a wide and diverse institutional makeup of employees and students, right? And so I think doing this work, going back to the core culture and climate, means holding multiple, sometimes competing interests. And then more importantly, trying to figure out, is academic freedom a pathway to help steward a conversation or steward an outcome? Or is at times academic freedom the detriment to where people are entering a space and not recognizing that actually based on how you're operating, it's actually not meant to be utilized that way, whether you're a faculty, staff, or a student. And so really recognizing, kind of thinking about institutional context, climate and culture matters. And in today's environments, having enough space in place to be able to evaluate all of these conditions at the same time is really critical and important.
Yeah, I love that response and what it adds, to conversation, building on Isaac's point, is really this sort of multi-level way of understanding where and how academic freedom is playing out, and for whom. And I think that's really important. And I also love, the sort of perspective of when is it a detriment. And I think we need to hold that in this kind of conversation that we're going to have today as well, because we don't often talk about it from that vantage point. So I'm glad you introduced that for us. So I want to turn to Jorge, and help invite you to kind of help us think about this concept of academic freedom from the student affairs lens. And so, we know in student affairs work, there's often the dynamics of managing free expression conflicts across a number of issues. And there's not always the same protective mechanisms that we just heard about, whether it be academic freedom for faculty or the unionized staff approach. And so I'm curious, Jorge, like, what does academic freedom mean for you in the context of thinking about student affairs?
Yeah, so I think someone mentioned, I forget which, somebody mentioned the concept of a shield in terms of academic freedom. And while necessarily in student affairs, we don't have that shield, that protection from the education that we do, I see it as more so like the foundation upon which our work rests on. Our role is created to maintain those necessary conditions that foster that academic freedom and that student learning to flourish. Just creating that environment where these things are happening. So in terms of the actual work that we do, we, where I put this, student affairs, it protects that freedom of assembly and that expression that students are seeking to gain, or that faculty are teaching their students. We don't necessarily get to choose which speech is protected, which we are charged with protecting the process in general by which all speech is protected, even the most hateful or challenging, so that they can occur safely. One example that I can give you is we recently had, I think it was last year, if I wasn't mistaken, Charlie Kirk actually was scheduled to speak on our campus, and something with our Department of Campus Safety not providing enough protection according to that individual. That individual then proceeded to post online where they encouraged students to bring their own arms to come to the event. And at that point, the institution stepped in and said, hey, this is not allowed. This is speech that we're not encouraging students to bring arms in the city of New York on our campus. So that we had to step in that moment. And we had to ensure that while we were given this individual the opportunity to speak and share their message, we also had a concern with the safety of our students as well. So balancing the competing rights, ensuring the speaker can be heard, and safeguarding the community as well. And also looking at our institutional responsibility. We're at the front line of managing the tension between a vibrant, open marketplace of ideas, city of New York. Something is always happening, something is always going on. The UN had their General Assembly last week, and it was a lot of protests, a lot of students involved. Faculty are voicing different opinions, and while we aren't necessarily obliged to, how do I put this? While we're trying to make sure that we have an inclusive learning environment, when conflicts do arise, faculty have that luxury of retreating back to the classroom or whatnot, while we have to step up, we in student affairs, step up and ensure that the aftermath of making sure that students are safe, making sure that people's rights are being heard and whatnot, it's still ongoing. So like in terms of when the academic freedom, back to the point I made at the beginning, that shield, while is not necessarily a shield for us student affairs professionals, we still have to focus on creating that environment where learning is happening, regardless of whether we agree with it or not. And I think that something that we're currently facing right now is the presidential administration coming down and giving us, giving a lot of institutions rules and regulations and ultimatums to do certain things in a certain way, regardless of the environment the balanced environment that we're trying to create. And it plays a lot. Particularly in my office, like I said, I'm in student conduct. Um, we've had protests, we've had speeches, we've had a variety of things happen on our campus or just outside of our campus, in which we're trying to ensure. It seems like lately we're just trying to ensure we don't piss off the administration, while also ensuring that students are having their opinions heard, that they're being safe about it and whatnot. So balancing the two has become rather difficult lately. So we start going down one path and we're like, nope, we got to make sure we don't tick these people off, or being micromanaged all the way from the top down to mid-level, all the way down to the bottom, to ensure that we're walking a fine line so that we're not targeted in the next round of educational madness from the administration.
Yeah, yeah, wow. One, for all three of our panelists, I really appreciate your, sort of vulnerability and thoughtfulness, and trying to narrate how you're seeing this concept of academic freedom, and how much it connects to First Amendment protections, freedom of assembly. But one of the things that I heard across all three responses, and Jorge's response is a great segue into the next part of the conversation I want to have with you all, is this idea that there's academic freedom exists in tension, right? So Isaac talks about the sort of faculty speaking and teaching, but also having a responsibility to sort of engage thoughtfully in that. Sort of Kelvin, helped us think about the institutional sort of critique, but then also creating, spaces for understanding when academic freedom can be a detriment. And then, we just heard from Jorge really sort of lay out this balance of like trying to create the space for people to engage and assemble, but then there's also an aftermath to things. So what I wanted us to drill into for this next little portion is, I would love to hear where you all feel, sort of the most pressure right now. Like you started to unsurface or uncover it a little bit in your opening responses, but as we think about academic freedom, where are you feeling pressure, and how do institutions, because that's sort of one of the shared variables that we have, how do institutions either show up or maybe fall short when you face them, sort of in the midst of trying to do this academic freedom and First Amendment work?
I think I can jump right in there. Um, I think my institution is in a very unique place, in which we have, how do I say this? We have a particular student who is very closely associated with the administration attending classes on our campus. And we are trying to find the right balance on how to do our jobs without taking people off. Our institution has done preemptive pulling back of funds in certain areas in case we get to a place where, like other institutions, we're targeted and whatnot. Um, and it's become quite difficult, particularly in the conduct DOS world, in trying to balance how do we meet the needs of our students while also ensuring, like I said earlier, that we don't tick them off, and the instability that comes. So not knowing where student loans may fall and how that's triggering students, not knowing how one particular incident on campus or our response to that incident may trigger either student backlash or presidential administrative backlash. Um, just really navigating difficult spaces of instability, knowing our office works really closely with Title IX, knowing that the previous administration gave us a set of standards for Title IX things, and knowing that this current one will roll things back. And how do we navigate? Like, it seems just like every time we take a step forward, we have to double check over each shoulder before we take the next step, and then we're rolled right back. And it's become quite the headache. in attempting to move forward with their students, and also navigating the sheer increase in mental health cases that we're having and what post-COVID student population looks like. I will say, and maybe this is a little off topic, the students I'm dealing with nowadays, we go from 0 to 300 immediately. It was like there's no in between. I'm like, okay, so navigating that space, plus navigating institutional pressure, plus navigating the chaos of what's going on in politics, it all is quite exhausting. And something our office is doing is making sure that we're taking our mental health days and just unplugging, because it can be overwhelming and it can be very taxing on someone. I was asked if I wanted to teach a course this fall, and I said, with what time? With what mental capacity? So I want to be able to do these things. I want to be able to help mold the next generation of future leaders in our country and whatnot. But it's just like there's just so many bubbles, so many pressures, so many hats that you have to wear. And with potential of funding being pulled in different areas, it's like we lost a staff member within our office, and it's just like, do we replace this person? Do we have the funds? Are we gonna, like, it's always a competing, feels like it's always a competing factor. At the core of it all, we have to navigate and put all of these factors aside and focus on the student experience.
Yeah, I appreciate that, because it's in this conversation we're obviously trying to focus on academic freedom and what that allows us to do, to research, to teach, to bring together different opinions and ideas. But what I'm hearing from you, Jorge, is there's so much going on, and you all, to your point, have additional layers that you have to think about, that it clouds out and makes that difficult. So that's definitely a pressure. I'm curious, from either Isaac or Kelvin, what other pressures are you feeling? So we have the everything all at once, dynamic that we heard from Jorge. What other pressures are you all feeling that either helps us get towards academic freedom in an ideal way, or creates a challenge for us that we need to kind of be thinking about?
Sure, I can hop in. So Demetri, you named thinking about a multi-level analysis. So when I think about what's up for me, particularly, I think at multiple levels. So I think for me on the individual level, I think what's most pressing right now is this issue of cross-generational engagement regarding belonging, bias, and accountability. And really thinking about the ways that people show up to what they envision of a definition of what a campus should feel like, include, and who's able to be there, and then navigating various opinions around what accountability means. For some people, accountability is only departure from the institution, right? And if that is not the threshold, then we have not met accountable. We are not accountable as an institution, right? Not navigating where their labor relation contracts or their kind of processes or their steps, right? And so I think oftentimes in this moment where there are heightened feelings or experiences, our exposure to topics and information influences the ways in which we define concepts and the way that we build relationship and community. I think the second thing that's really up for me right now is, I think, more myself, I'm an administrator at the university, so we are spending more time doing risk assessments at the institution and really understanding what is a risk that could yield potential impact to funding, to kind of public opinion or public perception, but also thinking about forecasting what are future policies or practices or procedures that we now need to put in place, because we have watched other institutions be subjugated to critical evaluation and critical feedback. I think the third piece, and this is a very US-centric perspective, but I think in this moment we're spending way more time being interpreters of state and federal policy, not simply for its execution perspective, but more importantly, I'm in a state that has the Freedom of Information Request Act, right? So what happens of the act that I do and it's FOIA'd, right? Do I have the backup? Do I have the process? Do I have the context to be able to say that regardless if this was a classroom or public lecture, was this a student organized event, what kind of capacity constraints and structures were there to ensure that we protect it from a holistic standpoint? So I think all of those levels of analysis are playing at the same time. And I feel like a lot of us in diversity, equity, and inclusion work are trying to not only navigate the whiplash, but then also navigate positionality within the institution to how people and how institutions should show up to that.
Yeah, thank you. There's so much with that accountability, the risk analysis, thinking about, the sort of public and state interpretation, multiple pressures there. Isaac, what about for you in your vantage point?
Yeah, first of all, I want to say thanks to everybody, and goes to Jorge and Kelvin and anybody else in this room and outside this room, anybody who is doing work with students and faculty and DEI work in this time is, real heroes in terms of holding the line. It's just really incredible and important work. And for me, I think that it's helpful. I think that what's particularly sad about this moment is that a lot of the things that are being either rolled back or explicitly weaponized, like Title VI and Title IX, were the results of political struggle, oftentimes led by students in these complicated situations, pushing on their institutions to be more inclusive and more welcoming. And so you have this story of student organizing, faculty organizing, staff organizing, and movement building that led to different kinds of possibilities in higher education institutions, not because they were granted through law, but because they were demanded from the grassroots. And it's explicitly that is being rolled back. And so I think that thinking about kind of how to balance these issues of speech and inclusion and culture is really what's at that. And so for me, I study right-wing think tanks in higher education and their influence on academic institutions. And for me, I think one of the biggest pressure points is this kind of well-funded and well-integrated backlash machine, right? It's not just like that an institution here, that a professor says something on Facebook and it makes it to Fox News because there's some sort of that's just a natural thing for a faculty's Facebook post to become national news. That's not a national news story, but because of decades of building a political infrastructure, there's now the mechanisms by which you have students that are being paid to publish stories in outlets like Campus Reform. You have Turning Points that are recording that are training students to record their faculty or to write outrage pieces about our research or our public speech. So I really see that within higher education, there has been an explicit effort to put that extra microscope, that extra detail, and to really focus on breaking down the kinds of grassroots movements and that have come out of higher education and political gains too. And so I think that that kind of political infrastructure is something that we really need to think about and understand and find ways to respond to, because and to build resources for responding to. So in terms of thinking about who is showing up in this moment too, I think that it's a really sad moment, because I think that the tension between faculty and academic institutions is actually a productive one in many cases, right? Where you have an institution that makes certain kinds of knowledge as possible, and then people who are pushing against that institution to be able to say a little bit more, are pushing disciplines in new directions, are challenging authority, and also teaching students on a college campus what an institution looks like and how to put pressure on that institution. But increasingly, because of this political machinery, we need to figure out the institution is under attack, which means that internal divide, that in places when an institution can just exist as a tension in and of itself, is now part of this broader national story. So finding ways in which the institution, with all of its internal tensions, can defend itself from these external pressures, I think is really important. And higher education institutions are not organized to defend themselves, right? They're actually internally organized to be kind of in tension, right? That I love what Demetri says, that academic freedom exists in tension, and I think that that's that's by design, right? Is to separate the production, or to kind of shield the protection of knowledge from external influences, to kind of create these kinds of tensions, or and so figuring out how to maintain that ability to have disagreements internally, to put pressure on institutions, to kind of, but at the same time, defend these institutions from these external threats. I think is really an essential but very incredibly difficult project.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And, as we move into this kind of last portion of the conversation before we open up for Q&A, so for those that are raring to go, get your questions ready. One of the things that I'm struck listening to the three of you is really this idea that there's this, shared, this kind of shared reality that academic freedom does something, whether you have it sort of directly as a faculty member or are impacted by it in diversity, equity, inclusion work or student affairs. There's this sort of mutual web, right? It's so cliche, but we are sort of all tied up into this sort of mutual web on college campuses. And at the same time, because we're getting this, sort of external threat, we're all also impacted by it. But I also think it's important to always try to stop and, sort of take a moment to dream and think. Isaac laid out the sort of like infrastructure of the right. It wasn't built overnight. And, it started in conversations and then sort of grew into something. And so I want to invite, each of our panelists to kind of think of, whether it is action or a policy or even a habit, something that people can do. What's something that might actually help protect academic freedom? You have this sort of room, this audience of people who might be able to take it and run with it. So what's something that you would want to share that does something sort of productive in response to help safeguard this protected value, or this value that needs protecting in this particular moment, in light of all the pressures that you all just laid out? I'm curious to hear each of you share briefly.
I can start with this one. I feel if I had a magic wand, one of the things I would love to see on many higher education institutions, they have either offices of faculty development or centers for teaching and learning. And it's a great place and space to think about communal learning, community engagement. And what I would love to see one day is these kind of spaces leading campus dialogue and engagement regarding academic freedom, serving as a framework for long-term engagement for all employees of the university, right? And so if we're serious about concretizing and grounding academic freedom, then we all have a responsibility to each other, right? And what better place than faculty who are charged with leading around communal development, intentional cognition, and learning development to help steward that process. And I think it allows us to build not only, it takes away the ivy towerness of education in a little bit to say, like, we're all in the same organization together. How do we actually work together and be together?
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I think that then also creates moments of reciprocity, and faculty needing to learn from whether it's DEI professionals or student life professionals about ways that faculty need to sort of follow along in those spaces and be supportive. And it creates opportunities for the lead and follower effect that I don't think we see enough. And so I really appreciate that idea. And it's a really good one. And it's concrete, right? Because the infrastructure already exists. Those things already exist on campus. And this just is an invitation to see that as a framework to invite dialogue. So it's a really great idea. What about you, Isaac or Jorge? The bar is set pretty high now. So any good ideas out there?
I think my idea plays a little bit off of Cullen's statement. I instantly thought of something that I've been trying to advocate for here at my institution, and it's this cross-institutional, so academic affairs, student affairs, and university admin task force, not only, or committee, not only to look at when crises come about and responding to these events in coordinated ways so that we're not hanging out to dry either side of the house, but more so being proactive and looking at policy creation, to review policies that may be ambiguous or clarify policies related to public space, guest speaker invitations, student organizations, and protest guidelines to inform our students also so that they know how to properly protest, they know where to put the pressure on and which aspect of the institution. Because quite often our students are protesting not knowing if they're reaching the person they need to reach, or not knowing um, the rules and policies around certain types of protests within our institutions. And that leads them to our office, which leads to backlash and whatnot. Something I faced, which is what led me to this thought and led me to this conversation about this task force, was when protests were happening, our office would be mandated by those above to do certain things in a certain way. And then the academic side of the house would then pile on to us, as well as those parents and as well as those students. And I'm like, wait a minute, we need to be one band, one sound, facing forward, making sure that we're all on the same message here and understanding where all of these decisions are being made so that we're together NYU, not just different aspects of things and being blasted on social media, newspaper articles, or ending up on CNN, MSNBC, Fox, whatever. Um, just making sure that we're all on one accord. So to me, yes, the magic wand, like Kelvin said, would be amazing to make some of this stuff just magically either disappear or fix itself. Um, but if anything, making sure that we're all on the same page, because it doesn't help when we're all looking in different directions for guidance, sending out different communication, confusing not only ourselves but our students. I think we just sit down, net it out, and when these crises happen, these events, making sure that we're sending the proper message together and not confusing everyone.
Yeah, shout out to the drumline reference, but well played. And one of the things that you said that really resonates is just this idea of, how are we planning? Yeah, everybody sort of after the pandemic was like, oh, then a new normal. But I think as campuses, like thinking through these protest policies, student support in the aftermath is the new normal. And so I really appreciate your encouragement for us to sort of acknowledge what's going on now, but these are things that we need to be well prepared for. I've said a lot, like we're using the 1960s sort of student activism playbook to support today's student activists, or not even today's student activists, but today's sort of socio-political climate, and it's different. And so you're inviting us to really think about how to do that work in a future-facing way, which I think is really important. What about for you, Isaac? What's your sort of magic wand? One thing that you would encourage us to do or think about?
Yeah, I mean, I'm trained as a political theorist, so I oftentimes go to the abstract and the conceptual. But I think what I'm hearing from Jorge and Kelvin is like really inspiring to me, and to think about the university not in this kind of like hierarchical way, but in a much more horizontal way, and to understand all aspects of the institution as also pedagogical, right? Is that teaching takes place in the classroom, it takes place in the research assignment, but it also takes place in how students navigate student life, figuring out how to protest, where to protest, what the policies are, what the consequences are for breaking those policies. How do you decide as a group if you're going to break that itself is a kind of form of pedagogy and teaching, and to kind of think about teaching and education as taking place in all of these spaces. And I think that there's a way to kind of bring this back to issues of academic freedom. There's a really great piece, I'm going to throw it in the chat, by Ilan Gershon, who makes the argument that we should think about academic freedom not as a very particular, as this kind of like thing that only faculty have, but instead to think of academic freedom as the faculty's version of a broader right, which is intellectual freedom in all workplaces, right? And that academic freedom and what that means is what intellectual freedom for faculty in higher education, or what higher education workers. But we can also think about what intellectual freedom in all workplaces looks like, and to respect each other's expertise and knowledge and understanding. So, for example, I was talking about this with Jorge and Kelvin, but before we jumped on, this spring I was on a committee with the dean of faculty and some students and other faculty, thinking about student protest code and student policy, time, place, manner, and just learned an incredible lot, and gained a new appreciation of this whole part. I'm a scholar of higher education. I study the university, right? But I never really seen inside what student life and the challenges that they face and the way that they make calculations and the kinds of tensions that they have to navigate, even though their office is literally a few thousand feet from where my office is. That's a whole side of the university that I hadn't thought about, I hadn't studied, I've read a few books about, but hadn't really engaged in that level. And so I think that this idea of recognizing the expertise, that all these different kinds of expertise go into making a world-class, excellent institution, right? That you need the expertise of the faculty and the researchers, but also of the administrators and the student life and the people who are doing the DEI programs and the people who are doing all of that other work that goes into the making of the complex kind of institution or ecosystem that academic institutions are. And I think that that idea of these external pressures trying to flatten out that complexity being a huge threat is something that we have to really push back against, and recognizing and building horizontal solidarities with all members, students, faculty, staff, administrators, I think is a really important step in thinking about that.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, and it just connects this idea that everybody wants to know know others and be known in ways that are meaningful to them. And I think as higher ed workers, whether we're faculty, administrators, in engaged in that intellectual work is really important. So I want to pause this for maybe a question or two before we close out time today. If there's anybody that has a really thoughtful question for our panelists, I would love to invite that. I see Madison jumped right in, so please unmute and share.
Yes, thank you. First, thank you for being willing to participate in a conversation like this. It's very funny because I am the Associate Director for the Office of Multicultural Student Affairs here at the University of Miami, but I'm also a PhD student in higher ed at Florida International University as well. And so I have been balancing the fine line of academic freedom when it comes to being a student and also being an administrator. If everyone's following the news, you all saw that somebody from the University of Miami got fired a couple weeks back when current events were happening. And so I will say that I applaud you all for being so willing to engage in a conversation about academic freedom because it's so tenuous at the moment. I guess my questions, I have like two because I was actually reading the compact that was sent out to some of the institutions for academic excellence in higher education last week, and I actually saw a copy of it. And I think, it goes to show where we're at in the state of higher ed, in which now there is a transaction in which now is being offered to certain institutions for federal funding. So I guess, as practitioners and having to be strategic, how do you all see this, continuing to either change the tide or push the tide when it comes to academic freedom? Because there's sections in here, and I can put it in the chat for those that haven't been able to see the compact. I got a copy of it from the UVA student newspaper, actually. But there's sections on there about institutional neutrality, and it has some stipulations on there about what constitutes academic freedom. And being in the student life realm and representing and being an advisor to certain student organizations and certain student groups on campus, I can tell that some of the language on there is very purposeful and intentional to prevent or curtail certain students from mobilizing. And then my second half of the question, so that's very loaded, but then for my student affairs facing folks, I feel like in all of this change for higher ed, there's been a very big focus on us as administrators, faculty, staff, and how it's affecting our ability to do work and engage in conversation. But I also feel like in that same way, the student voice has kind of been snuffled and shuffled as an expectation that, hey, we're doing all of this to continue being able to provide services and being able to host discourse, and you all just kind of need to take it. And I think from my students' perspective, I've seen a shift in how they're choosing to engage and mobilize and converse because they're very unsure about how far that sense of academic freedom as a student can extend. So yes, I guess I just welcome thoughts on those two things, because it's obviously a very interesting time. So yes.
Yeah, so rapid
I can
fire responses. Yep.
I can address the first part of your question. And for me, being in the student conduct world, while exhausting, I double and triple check that the decisions that I'm making align with what the messaging that the institution is putting out there. For example, when students come in and we have conversations about their actions and maybe disciplinary actions afterwards, and they're sitting in front of me and asking, how can you do this to me? How can you align yourself with this, and that? And I have to remind them I'm a professional, and then I have personal opinions. You are not connected to my personal opinions. And quite often students are like, just quit. And I'm like, yeah, but you're not going to pay my rent. You're not going to do these things. And I have to remind them of real life things that happen um, on the other side of, oh, you could just quit and find another job. It's not that simple. So quite often I am always double checking to ensure that the decisions that I'm making, that I'm putting forward, because I know, one, they're going to end up in the media. Two, they're going to be on social media. And three, the NYU has awesome lawyers that'll back me up. However, I want to make sure that if something were to change along the route of approval, that I'm going to be okay, that I'm not going to be seen as the scapegoat. And then ultimately you see me in the media as, oh, NYU fired this person because of this decision. So while it's exhausting and something that I would rather not have to think about every time I make a decision, I double and triple check with my supervisor and dean of students to make sure that my decision before I put it out there aligns with what the institution is currently, the message that's currently coming from the institution. That's just my way of double and triple checking and making sure that I'm okay. And I would be open to hear from others what they're doing to make sure that they're okay. But in the meantime, that's all I can offer.
Yeah, I'll be really quick. So in response to the first part of your question regarding the compact, so I put on my like organization and governance hat in relationship to that piece, because for me, I think the future of the compact will be stewarded by whether or not institutions are governed by a board of governors or board of trustees versus as an institution part of a higher education system. And so what I have already observed is that the institutions that have already gotten the invitation are usually singularly stewarded and governed, right? And so we'll be curious to play that out over the next 5 years of, are we avoiding those institutions, unless they're flagships, that are part of systematized experiences and accreditation bodies? On the second piece of the question around the student voice and student experience, I think a lot about, I go back to this idea of risk assessment. And whether we like it or not, I think administrators are having to ask the question, in what ways are students risks? And depending on where we put them in that place means that then how do we steward a relationship? I tell my team all the time is that there will probably be times where you disagree with my decisions, because my position as an associate vice president is to inherently protect the institution. Right. And so balancing that tension is always, I think, a reality that we don't talk enough about.
So much. So we are actually at time, and I want to be mindful of everybody's time. But Andrew, I invite you to send me an email. Happy to follow up on your question sort of offline. So one, thank you so much to our panelists. It was a great conversation. You all are doing great and thoughtful work. So thank you. And then, on behalf of ASHE, thank you everybody for, coming out and thinking about this really important topic. I think one of the last thing I'll say is, I think at a time when so much is under attack, to give up spaces to think and to connect and build community is one of the worst things we could do. So I really just appreciate everybody coming out, making space to continue to learn, to keep our minds sharp, and to see how other people are moving in this space and time. So I appreciate you all. Look forward to connecting in the future, and I hope everyone has a good afternoon.
Great. Thank you.